Thank you for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. I am convinced that I am here today alive, standing on this stage, because of the part of myself I call the invisible, or my inner strength. Because when I was living on a slatted wood park bench on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, the projections that people foisted on me were dire. 1, they said, you're going to die. 2, they said, you will live the rest of your life out in an institution. When you are unhoused, it is rare that anyone ever acknowledges this invisible part of you that is your inner strength. I am a reporter for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and as you heard, since my emergence from this park bench, my stories have appeared in many major media outlets. And with the context of the information that I'm going to share with you today, I am convinced that you will see that my story is not merely my story. My story is society's story. And as I take you on this journey with me, I want you to know 2 things. 1, I'm not trying to garner your sympathy or your pity. I don't want your sympathy or your pity. I want to widen and shift your perspective about the unhoused. Because when we shift and widen the perspective of the unhoused, that's when things really do change and radically change. And 2, I'm not trying to make you have more empathy. As popular as that angle is these days, I don't believe that you can force anyone to have more empathy. You either have empathy or you don't. And I know that you're here today because you care. In fact, I know that nearly half of you are working with tenants who have been recently unhoused. And I just want to give you a sincere shout out. As essential workers, As essential workers, I know how hard your job is. And I wish that when I had spent that time on that park bench, that I had one of you in my corner, because I know that if I had, my trajectory would have been exponentially better. Are you with me? Yes. Please raise your right hand. Great. I have bad news for you. Keep your hand up. You have just been in a horrific car crash. There is glass shattered everywhere. You are injured to the point of being unable to regulate your nervous system. In fact, you are so discombobulated that you can't even figure out how to use your phone. You have also been rendered unhoused. And so there is no place for you to go to seek refuge, peace, or healing. You're going to have to pull yourself up by your proverbial bootstraps without a home on the streets of New York City. Are you with me? Okay. The other bad news, this part of the exercise might make you feel vulnerable and uncomfortable, and that is the point of it. If you could please take out your wallet and your phone. I'll wait while you do that. Okay. Now you have your wallet and your phone. Are you with me? Please hand it to someone you don't know. Did you hand it to someone you don't know? Okay, thank you. So no matter how much money you had 10 minutes ago, you don't have it anymore. Are you with me? Okay. Information is so important. Information is vital, and information through storytelling is why I'm here today. And there's so much information out there about housed people and how trauma awareness, that widening and the shifting of the lens, saves lives. For example, a University of San Francisco study found that women with breast cancer lived twice as long if they went to cognitive therapy than those who did not, because they regulated their nervous systems and dealt with the extreme trauma that they were enduring. So you may ask yourselves, right? Well, why isn't this information being applied as intensely and as consistently as it could be to the unhoused? I assert that the reason for this is because we have been trained to buy into socially crafted, carefully cultivated messages that blame and shame the unhoused for being unhoused. And in this pathology, the unhoused individuals become nothing but a bundle of pathologies and a problem that needs to be fixed. Are you with me? Okay, so if you wouldn't mind just closing your eyes for a second. You've been in this car crash, you're unhoused, you don't have any money, the friends and family that you would have turned to for support, you can't, because you can't even use your phone. But you do have your internal strength. And so what does that look like? Well, for me, when I was unhoused, my internal strength looked like a collection of memories. A memory of my father holding my hand as a child. He loved me so much, and he made up a name for me, Scode. And he would sing that song around the house as he cleaned and gardened, Scodalo-E-A. And that memory also looked like when I had horses before I became unhoused. And I used to ride them across rivers and under trees and hold on to their manes and feel the freedom and the power that they offered me. I loved them like family. And my internal strength also looked like my spiritual affiliation. And if you can't relate to any of these things, that's perfectly fine. Perhaps your inner strength includes a memory of a pristine moment in nature on your last vacation. Just whatever they are, just bring those memories to the forefront of your mind and just join me for a moment. This is what I call your strength-based glasses, and you're going to need them. Why is a strength-based perspective, that shifting of the lens, why is it so important? Because without them, without the vision that someone has inner strength, that person becomes subhuman. Are you with me? Thank you. I'm going to divide the stage into 3 different parts. So over here at the podium, this represents my professional and my personal accomplishments. So when I stand here, try to remember, please, that I just finished that fellowship at Yale. I work for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. I have owned 2 homes, and I've founded 2 businesses in my life. This represents, of course, my homelessness, 815 consecutive days in homelessness. A time period during which I was targeted, stalked, abducted, and sexually assaulted for a period of about a year by a man who worked in the homeless outreach center where I went to pick up my daily hygiene kits. And during this time, I was incarcerated for 6 months because I bathed in a river. And so I was put in an 8x10 jail cell. After that, I was institutionalized for lying naked on the streets of Salt Lake City. And the center of the stage represents our inner strength. Are you with me? Great. So, like it does for every other unhoused person, my homelessness started with a series of traumas I call the great tsunami that swept through my life. It started with a fire that burned my house down. And then I went into that house while it was burning to save my landlord. And that worked. I got to save her life, and I was made very vulnerable to post-traumatic stress syndrome because of what happened to my nervous system in that life-threatening event. A few weeks later, maybe a month, my mom was diagnosed with a terminal disease and began to quickly die. And so that also made me extremely vulnerable to PTSD because I was witness to death. And then my family disowned me over inheritance issues that were past as well as present regarding my mom. So I lost my family support system. at which point I moved in with a customer of that one of the businesses that I owned. I didn't know her very well, but I had a 100-acre horse ranch to go to. And I thought in so doing, I would be able to stay attached to my horses, my dogs, and my cats. As soon as I moved in, my dog was diagnosed with a terminal disease. And in all of this all occurred in a year span. I stopped being able to cope emotionally. And in being unable to cope emotionally, I couldn't run my business. And in not being able to run my business, I was unable to pay the rent, and she asked me to leave. And so, as trauma does when it is not intercepted, it escalates. And within 2 weeks of being at a homeless shelter in Salt Lake City, I was targeted by the man that I told you about. He came up to me and bowed in a very gentlemanly way and offered a pair of winter gloves. And it was November of 2014, and I was freezing. I didn't even have a coat, let alone gloves. So I accepted, thinking, well, that'll be the end of that. Only it wasn't. Then he offered a duffel bag because he saw that the luggage that I had was busted and all my clothes were spilling onto the ground. And so he said, my duffel bag is in my storage shed, so let's go get it. And so I did. And I just have to say here, I'd never been hurt before in my life. So maybe, I was naive. And so I followed him to the storage shed, and he opened the door, and as soon as he opened it, he shoved me inside, and what happened was unspeakable. And he didn't open the door for 3 days. And when he did, I stopped talking. And those sexual assaults continued for a year. And when I was institutionalized for lying naked on the streets, they drugged me to the point where I couldn't walk straight. I had to hold on to the hospital rails in order to just walk down the hallway. None of the doctors or nurses who locked me up in the psych wards or jail cells asked me about any kind of trauma. In fact, I don't think the word trauma was ever mentioned, and so I was misdiagnosed with a plethora of mental illnesses I didn't have. Once I tried to back away from the two men in the hospital who were trying to give me my pills. And in backing away, they came closer, and that reminded me of the threat of my assailant. And so, of course, I took the pills. Only in my emergence, when I was once again working as a journalist about trauma awareness and homelessness, would I learn why I could let go of the shame of lying naked in the streets of Salt Lake City. Quote, a person's reaction to trauma can and often is as dramatic as what happened to them, trauma experts told me over and over again. By the way, I began to write 3 days after I emerged from that park bench. and not once did I have another dose of the medications that had been prescribed for my supposed insanity. Within a year, a story I wrote about my homelessness and emergence from it ran on the front page of the Washington Post. I began writing regularly for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and the more I interviewed the trauma awareness experts, the more I was healed, and the more I was able to share that healing information with the world. Recently, I discovered a research paper from French psychologist Pierre Janet. His paper, published 120 years ago, is as pertinent now as it was back then. This is what he said, quote, "Trauma survivors continue the action, or rather the futile action, an attempt at action, since when the trauma began. So my assailant had repeatedly threatened to kill me and stuff me in a body bag. But before that, he had made me disrobe. Suddenly, relief and self-forgiveness flooded through me when I read that from Pierre Janet. My brain had associated disrobing with the vulnerable action that had saved my life. I kept reporting. I kept learning. Did you know that blacks constitute 13% of the general population, but they comprise 40% of the homeless population? I also learned that a 2019 Rutgers study had found that in America, quote, there has been a tendency for clinicians to overemphasize the relevance of psychotic symptoms and overlook symptoms of major depression in African Americans compared with other populations. Fact. Society's projections about the unhoused, coupled with systematic structural racism, are magnified in homelessness, a place where people are routinely stripped of their self-agency. Are you with me? Okay. Remember the scene of your accident. Please raise your right hand. You are going to do some things in this accident that don't make a lot of sense because you are discombobulated. You're not in your nervous system. You're not connected to it. Does that make sense? Okay. Perhaps you will walk to a park for peace and healing. Later, though, people are going to say to you, why didn't you go call the police? And you are going to say, because I couldn't think straight. Thank you. And they, after hearing your response, are going to say or think or diminish you forever for being a person who cannot navigate life. Fortunately, I got to interview a woman for Slate about a story about trauma in homelessness. And after that interview, she was a trauma-aware psychologist, I asked her if she would be my therapist. And so after the story was published, she agreed. And we began to work together. And then within 6 months, she said, I really want to tell you something. You are not any of those things that you were diagnosed with. you have post-traumatic stress syndrome. And she was connected to the hospital that had institutionalized me, and she went into the records and replaced those misdiagnoses with the truth that I had been severely and consistently traumatized. And I was also fortunate enough to, in my first home out of homelessness, work with a trauma-aware agency run by a woman who had been offering trauma-aware trainings to the FBI and then recognized and awarded for her expertise. And in our first meeting, I was staring at the ground, and she asked me to look at her, and she said, you know, there's a lot of women who are sexually assaulted in homelessness. And later I would learn that the American Journal of Public Health had done a study that showed that of the 300 women surveyed, 30% had been sexually assaulted in homelessness. And in that normalization, I began to have the first conversation that I'd had with anybody in 2 years, and she looked up my name on the internet and she saw my writing website, and she said, "You're going to be a writer. You're going to get your voice back, and it's going to be powerful." But I did not emerge new-winged and free. I emerged shackled by other people's stereotypes. Crazy, lazy, drug-addicted. Have you ever wondered where those stereotypes come from? In an in-depth essay that I wrote for Mother Jones titled, "I Am Not Your Project," I interviewed Harvard professor Lucy White, as well as many other housing experts. In the early 1980s, White had written a research paper about the creation of homelessness as a public problem. It was about how the still standing stereotypes surrounding the unhoused were created during the Reagan era of budget cuts to help the poor. A lot of people don't know this, but those stereotypes were almost exclusively created by progressive folks who wanted to help the poor. But they made some mistakes. Basically, the advocates identified themselves with the cause of homelessness because, quote, "in our adverse situation, we couldn't see any better strategic plan," White said. And so society created a new species of people, and we carefully crafted an image of them, one of broken passivity and victimhood, people in need of constant scrutiny and monitoring. Wrote White, there simply seemed to be no better way in the 1980s to picture the urgency of housing market failure and to give new luster to the very old struggles of the poor. And so when I walked away from the park bench the last time in May of 2016, it was as if I were walking straight into a social experiment. Because in all actuality, I was. A landlord told me she gave me reduced rent in her spare bedroom because you are my project. And when I applied for a job as a secretary at a nonprofit that helped the unhoused, I was told that my background was too unstable to get me anything other than minimum wage, which wasn't enough to even pay for a studio apartment. Then, about 4 years ago, into my emergence, when things were finally going really well, I was working at the Economic Hardship Reporting Project as a fellow. I was in my own one-bedroom apartment. I got a letter in the mail. And the hospital where I had been institutionalized wanted to talk to me. They wanted $47,000 for the care they had given me when I had been locked up in their institution. I called the hospital, this time as a reporter, and asked them why, when I was an unhoused woman, they had not written off the bill as charity. And they said they didn't know I was an unhoused woman. They said I had refused to talk to them when I was institutionalized. And so I went into my hospital records that I had collected for my story with the Washington Post, and I found quotes from at least 2 doctors who said that they knew I was unhoused. So I called the hospital and told them about the records and showed them the records, and they immediately expunged my debt and cleared my credit. Why? Because I came to them with the power of the press. I don't think those administrators ever expected me, a Black, formerly unhoused woman, to return to them as a reporter fully in my power. I have shown you how widening and shifting that lens is not about fixing a broken person, and nor is it about creating a human being out of nothing. It's about aligning with the internal strength that is within them, buried in trauma, and bolstering that strength with resources. And so now is the time for a call to action. What can we do? Well, we can start by watching our language. If we are helping someone out of homelessness, we are not giving them a second chance. We are giving ourselves the chance to prove that we care about people. We can educate ourselves. There's a great book by Canadian physician Dr. Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No. And he talks a lot about trauma and coping mechanisms and substance abuse and all kinds of things that help people in horror endure what they are going through, like homelessness. And he says, he's very famous for saying this, we shouldn't be asking why the addiction. Rather, we should be asking why the pain. If you are a landlord and you can afford it, reduce your rent enough so that someone can live with you without worrying about falling into the abyss of homelessness. If you are a nonprofit manager, consider hiring someone with lived experience while acknowledging that that lived experience is every bit as important as a college degree. And if you are a government worker, get behind and support and fund truly trauma-aware programs and training. Because if you just support programs that are archaic in nature and say, oh, well, that person's getting therapy, but if that therapy is blaming and shaming and re-traumatizing people, then we're just going in the same cycle. So I didn't forget about you. You can have your wallet and your phone back. And I'm really happy, that you get to go home tonight, that we get to go home tonight and absorb the information that will be shared for the entire day. But just remember that when you come into contact with one of the 880,000 people approximated to be unhoused in this country on any given day, no matter how disheveled, how traumatized, how much in pain they are, there is always the internal strength. Thank you.